First 7 verses are simply the story of the birth of Cain and Abel. And something happens here that's going to happen over and over in the Bible. The younger son is preferred to the older son. Abel, the younger son, is preferred to Cain, the older son. There's no real reason given for it. It's not necessarily that Cain gave a bad sacrifice. For reasons that are not explained, God chose the gift of the younger son to the older son. And this will happen, as I said, again and again in the Bible. Cain realizes that God prefers the gift of his brother, and so his countenance is downcast. And you can see there's still a dialogue between God and Abel. He says, what's wrong? And he says, you can overcome this. Now, have you ever read John Steinbeck's East of Eden? Anyone? Okay. It's a novel that pretty much is based on this story of Cain and Abel. They're these two brothers who are at odds with each other. And in that novel, there is a Chinese man who plays an important role, and his whole life long he's trying to understand the story of Cain and Abel and what it says about sin. And he's so interested that this Chinese man learns Hebrew so he can get to the original text. And he says, what the text says is, even though sin attacks us, we can overcome it. And he tries to tell one of the brothers this. But that's the point here, that sin is always going to be at the door, but you can overcome it. But Cain doesn't accept what God says. So now you have the story of the murder of Abel told in a single verse. Cain said to his brother Abel, let us go out into the field. And when they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and he killed him. So now you have the first murder. And what the text is showing us is, first of all, you have the sin of Adam and Eve who disobeyed God's commandment. And sin produces sin. So that if we could talk about the sin of Adam and Eve as being the original sin, all of us in one way or another participate in that sin and confirm it, and Cain does it by killing his brother Abel. Now, notice again, God will come and question Cain just as he came and questioned Adam. Then the Lord asked Cain, where is your brother Abel? And Cain's answer is already a lie. And of course, it's almost insulting to God. He says, I do not know. Of course he knows, he has just murdered him. Am I my brother's keeper? Almost defiant to God in his response. Then you have God's response to Cain. God said, what have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are banished from the ground that opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. So the blood of his own brother Abel, which now has sunk into the ground, curses the ground against Cain. And if you till the ground, it shall no longer give its produce. You shall become a constant wanderer on the earth. Now this punishment is almost greater than the one given to Adam. Adam still can till the ground, but he's only going to get produce by the sweat of his brow. But here with Cain, because of the horrendous nature of his sin, the ground is cursed against him, and he can no longer produce anything from the ground. And now he was a farmer, and now he becomes a wanderer. Cain protests that his punishment is too great to bear. Look, you've banished me from the ground. I must avoid you and be a constant wanderer on the earth. Anyone may kill me at sight. And again, just as God protected Adam and Eve by giving them garments, so God is going to protect Cain. Not so, the Lord, Yahweh, said to him, if anyone kills Cain, Cain shall be avenged 7 times. So the Lord puts a mark on Cain, maybe a tattoo to identify him, so that no one would kill him at sight. Cain then left the Lord's presence and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Nod is, there's no particular place, it's just, the basic word means wandering, and now because of his sin, he becomes a wanderer. He can no longer be the farmer that he was. So now you see the sin of Adam and Eve has produced the sin of their child. In addition to this story of Cain and Abel, we're now going to see a number of genealogies. Actually, there are 4 genealogies in the book of Genesis. And at first you might be tempted to just kind of skip over them. They're long and all, but they play an important role. The first genealogy we have are the descendants of Cain. So Cain had intercourse with his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Cain also became the founder of a city which he named after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad became the father of Mehujael. And Mehujael became the father of Methuselah, and Methuselah became the father of Lamech. Now Lamech, you'll see, is a particularly nasty figure. Lamech takes 2 wives. The name of the first is Ada, the name of the second Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal, who became the ancestors of those who dwelt in tents and keep livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He became the ancestors of all who play the lyre, the reed, and the pipe. Zillah, the second wife, on her part gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the ancestors of all who forged instruments of bronze and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And then Lamech says to his 2 wives, Ada and Zillah, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, listen to my utterance. I have killed a man for wounding me. I've killed a young man for bruising me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, Lamech 77 times. We could put it, if Cain was an awful fellow, his son, not his immediate son, Lamech, is worse by 77 times. So you can see, from the point of view of the book of Genesis, evil is growing in intensity. We've moved from the disobedience of the first man and the woman. We've moved to the murder of their son Cain. And now we move to Lamech, who is worse than all of them. We're then told in verse 25 that Adam again had intercourse with his wife. She gave birth to a son whom she called Seth. And she calls him Seth because God has granted me another offspring in place of Abel. The name basically means something like a replacement, if you will. And to Seth, in turn, a son was born, and he was named Enosh. At that time, people began to invoke the Lord by name. So there's a little note of grace. People are at least beginning to call upon God. Now, we then come to the first great genealogy from Adam. Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt.
It's okay.
Who do these women
I was wondering if someone was going to ask that question. I'm going to give you the answer of John Chrysostom. I've been reading his homilies. Okay? Now, first of all, if you just take the logic of the story as it is, you're exactly right. They're not there. Okay. John Chrysostom, very, very, he's called the Golden Moth, wonderful orator. He faces this question, and he says, well, in the ancient world, when, you're not going to like my answer. But in the ancient world, sons were given names, but the women are not so important. So there were women there were other women, but they were just not mentioned here because they're not so important. That was the response of John Chrysostom to your question. The response is, I don't, in effect, the story is not logical in this, quite honestly, the story is not logical, but it doesn't bother the biblical author, you know? Okay. All right. So I don't know where the women came from. It's just okay. But again, it's important not to try to read the story as an historical account. If you're trying to read it as a story of an historical account, then that kind of question is troublesome. But it's not that.
You have to have women.
Pardon?
Even if you don't.
Oh, I'm sorry, Patty.
Even if you don't think of it historically, you still have to have women to have these men.
Of course you do. Yeah, I'm not going to argue with you, Patty. You're exactly right. Keep in mind, we're living in a world and in a culture where the male is the dominant figure, okay? We don't live in that, I hope we don't live in that kind of culture today, but we have to acknowledge that. Now, and you'll notice in all of these genealogies, and you'll notice especially in the next one, only the men will be mentioned. You know, obviously they had wives, but they're just off to the side. That's why John Chrysostom gave the answer that he gave. But now you have this long genealogy that goes from Adam to Noah, and it's Noah that we'll be talking about next week. And what's interesting about this genealogy, well, I won't even tell you, you'll pick it up immediately. This is the record of the descendants of Adam. When God created human beings, God made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female. When they were created, he blessed them and named them humankind. It's as though you're beginning the story of creation all over again. Adam was 130 years old when he begot a son in his likeness after his image, and he named him Seth. So this is a second genealogy. First of all, we talked about the genealogy of Cain. Now we're going to talk about a fuller genealogy, the genealogy of Adam. And in a sense, the genealogy of Cain ends with Lamech, and that's the end of it. But now, Adam has other sons through Seth, and this genealogy will continue on to Noah. Adam lived 800 years after he begot Seth, and he had other sons and daughters. Okay? They're not named, though. The whole lifetime of Adam was 930 years, and he died. Why are you laughing? When Seth was 105 years old, he begot Enosh. Seth lived 800 years and 807 years after he begot Enosh, and he had other sons and daughters. But the only one that's important is Enosh, because we're establishing a line to Noah. The whole lifetime of Seth was 912 years. Then he died. When Enosh was 90 years old, he begot Kenan. Enosh lived 815 years after he begot Kenan, And he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Enosh was 905 years, then he died. Kenan was 70 years old when he begot Mahalalel, a very young man. Kenan lived 840 years after he begot Mahalalel. He had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Kenan was 910 years. When Mahalalel was 65, notice they're getting younger as they give birth, he begot Yared. Mahalalel lived 830 years after he begot Yared, and he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Mahalalel was 895 years. When Yared was 162 years old, he begot Enoch. Now, this is a genealogy of 10 people. Enoch is the 7th person in the genealogy, the perfect number, okay? Yared lived 800 years after he begot Enoch, and he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Yared was 962 years, then he died. When Enoch, number 7, was 65 years old, he begot Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he begot Methuselah for 300 years. And he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Enoch was 365 years. Not too long. Enoch walked with God and was no longer here, for God took him. So unlike the others, Enoch does not die. God takes him to himself. Later on, in Judaism and in the early church, there are writings attributed to Enoch. Why? Because Enoch is in heaven with God, and he knows what heaven is like. And so the writings of Enoch describe for us heaven. So this Enoch is a very important figure in early Judaism and early Christianity because he never died. He lived with God, and his writings tell us about the heavens. Now, Methuselah is my favorite, was 187 years old. He begot Lamech, another Lamech. Methuselah lived 782 years after he begot Lamech, and he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Methuselah was 969 years, then he died. He's the oldest of all of them. And so that's why you get the expression as old as Methuselah, the oldest of all people. When Lamech was 182 years, he begot a son and named him Noah, saying, "This one shall bring us relief from our work and the toil of our hands out of the very ground that the Lord has put under a curse." So now there is a real sense of hope that Noah is going to bring a kind of salvation. Lamech lived 195 years after he begot Noah, and he had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Lamech was 777 years, then he died. Perfect number, 777. Then Noah had, when Noah was 500 years old, he begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now later on, next week, after the story of the flood, we'll have the genealogy from Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, all the way down to Abraham. And from these 3 sons, Shem, come all the Semitic people. From Ham come all the Canaanite people. And from Japheth come all the Indonesian people. So from the point of view of this genealogy, after the flood, these 3 sons will populate the whole world. Okay, the 3 sons of Noah are Shem. He becomes the father of all the Semitic peoples of the world. Ham becomes the father of all of the Canaanite peoples, and Jaffa becomes the father of all the Indo-European people, from the point of view of this ancient geography, all right? Now I'm going to tell you one other interesting story about John Chrysostom. He had very long, he preached about, I think, about 100 sermons on the book of Genesis. And he preached them, a sermon nearly every day. And the sermons, I've been reading them, they're about 20, they're often 20 and 30 pages, which means he probably preached 2 or 3 hours. It's kind of the entertainment of the day. When he gets to Noah, he has about 10, 12 sermons on Noah. And when he gets, you'll notice that Noah is the only good person left on the earth. And he notes that Noah didn't have children until he was 500 years old. Now, why? This is very important. This is, he says Noah was showing his self-control to a world which had lost all sense of self-control. Now, on the one hand, we smile, and I smile too, but what's interesting here is that every word of Scripture is important for John Chrysostom, and he can draw out a lesson from every little detail. That's the point I want to get across, all right? I got just a couple minutes, and I'm going to... Huh? I'm getting to the Nephilim right now. All right. So now we saw in these genealogies, these people have these extraordinary long lifetimes, because it's a time before history, and it's in the ancient world, what is old is good, what is new is just fanciful. Okay? And so these people had extraordinary lives, length of life, but they still died because of Adam's sin. Now, just these verses in chapter 6, the first part of chapter 6. When human beings began to grow numerous on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, probably referring to the angels, okay? The sons of God are, God has a court, and it's an angelic court, and they're called the sons of God. They saw how beautiful the daughters of human beings were, and so they took for their wives whomever they pleased. So this is a great violation. From the heavenly realm, they come and have intercourse in the earthly realm. Then the Lord said, because of this, my spirit shall not remain in human beings forever, because they are only flesh. Their days shall comprise 120 years. So now the length of people's lives have been reduced. They'll no longer live 800, 900. They're going to live at the most to be 120. Why? Because there's been, well, two reasons. There's this violation of the angels coming down, but also God makes an important statement here. Human beings are simply flesh, and my God's Spirit can't dwell in flesh forever. That's why if God's Spirit is to dwell in us, there has to be a resurrection from the dead and a resurrection body, where the flesh is changed and transformed. Now, Patty, the Nephilim appeared on earth in those days, as well as later, after the sons of God had intercourse with the daughters of human beings who bore them sons. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown. They probably referred to gigantic figures. And again, you're looking back to this primordial time, and there were giants in those days. You've heard that little expression, right? There were giants in those days. And where do these Nephilim, these giants, come from? They are the offspring of angels and human beings. All right, that's now. I'm going to stop at this point, but I just want to give you a sense of what we've done here and what we're going. The original question is, how did sin and death get into the world? And the answer that the book of Genesis is giving us is that sin came into the world because human beings transgressed God's commandment. And sin begets sin. So the sin of Adam and Eve leads to the murder of Abel by Cain. It then leads to greater violence in Lamech, who is worse than his father Cain. It leads to the violation of the human realm when the angels come down. And so that next week, when we come to the story of Noah, God is so upset with humankind that he is going to wipe it out entirely, except for Noah and his family, who is the only just person. Okay? And with sin comes this other powerful force, death. And this is why St. Paul says that Christ has to come into the world to overcome these two powers and forces that we by our human ourselves cannot overcome. Now what I'll do next week is look at the story of Noah and the flood. I'll look at the story of the Tower of Babel, and then that will set us up for the stories of for Abraham and Jacob and Joseph and Isaac. Yes, Tom?
It's a what-if question.
Yeah.
What if God had chose to turn the other cheek on Adam and Eve because they were childlike before they ate the apple? If he had chose to forgive Adam and Eve at that moment and say, okay, I know you're childlike and I told you not to do it, I'll give you a chance, a second chance. All this soap opera stuff probably wouldn't have occurred. In my childlike thinking.
Yeah, no. I'm just going like this because I don't have an answer to your question. Again, keep in mind, the way we kind of grow up, we think of Adam and Eve as these two historical figures. And if you think of it that way, then you can ask the kind of question, quite a legitimate question that you ask. The story of Adam and Eve, and in fact all of these stories of the first 11 chapters, are not stories of particular human beings that lived. These are not historical accounts. These are the ways that the ancients tried to make sense of how did the world come into existence? Why is there a world? How did human beings come into existence? How did sin and death enter the world? So the author, the sacred author there, wouldn't ask, well, you and I might ask that question, Tom. He wouldn't ask that question because, or she, whoever's writing this, because what they're trying to do is to respond, why is the world the way it is? There's something wrong. There's something not right, quite right. One thing I used to often say to students at the when I was teaching, it says, of all the doctrines, we have to believe all the doctrines. You know, it requires faith. But I would often jokingly say there's only one doctrine that doesn't require faith at all, because it's so obvious, is the doctrine of original sin. All you have to do is pick up the paper every morning and see that human beings do the same thing over and over and over and over again. And what it says is there's something wrong, primordial wrong, that has to be overcome. I haven't answered your question at all, Tom. Augie.
Well, the little bit that you introduced, is suddenly human beings are reproducing with angels instead of the usual way.
Right.
And I wanted to know, where did that come from? I know among Greeks there was intercourse between
Right.
gods, my legendary forebear's mother was impregnated by a god. Among the Babylonians, it was that way, and among the Egyptians. Were they borrowing, or?
Yeah, okay. Let me repeat Augie's question because some of you may not have heard. He said, where does this story of the angels having intercourse come from? And actually, the story kind of comes up all of a sudden. And he says, were they borrowing this kind of story? Because it does occur in kind of Greek and Roman mythology. And I would say the answer, yeah, somebody didn't sit down and write the book of Genesis from beginning to end. It's a collection of lots of stories and traditions that occurred over hundreds of years. Now, the creation stories, for example, have parallels in other ancient literature of that time. So the ancient Hebrews borrowed those stories, but when they borrowed the stories, they didn't write them exactly the way they were. They adapted them to their own faith. And I think similarly here, a story like this probably is borrowed, at least the idea of it is borrowed from a surrounding culture. Yeah, so much of the material here, you'll find parallels in Sumerian and other culture, but we know that. We have this story of Gilgamesh, story of creation, and there are similarities between these stories.
What's fascinating to me is that the stories are all similar, that this question humankind has been asking cuts across all cultures, and the answers are the same across all cultures.
Well, they're not exactly the same. Yeah.
But the understanding of temptation, the understanding of evil, there's a human desire to know God.
Yep. Right. And that's, all cultures have some sort of a story about the origin. People want, where did we come from? Now we ask it in a scientific way, but people want to know where did we come from? Not only why are we here? And why are there things that are wrong in our everyday life? So, and that's what these stories are trying to answer. Now, the difference, at least for us as believers, is these are inspired texts. Not in the sense that they're scientifically or historically correct. That's not what inspiration means. What inspiration means is that the truth of our salvation is contained here. So for me, as a believer, what these stories tell me is that there is death and sin entered the world through human transgression. They became powers and forces that we of ourselves can't overcome. That's why God sends His Son to do what we couldn't do. So it's not by accident that the New Testament presents Christ as the new Adam, as we saw last week. Kind of reversing what the old Adam did. If you have time before next week, it would be helpful to read chapters 6 through 11 of Genesis. Those are the stories of Noah, some more genealogies, but also the story of the Tower of Babel.
How can they get 800 years? He lived 800 years. He lived 1,000 some more years. How can they say that?
Well, to go back, all right. Other cultures had their ancient heroes living 20 and 25,000 years. They can say it in part. I have to come back to this theme. They're not writing history, okay? But we live in a world where the new is good and the old is bad. Or, it's outdated. They lived in a world where they greatly distrusted anything that was new. In the earlier ages, not only were they better, but they were a kind of a golden period in some ways. So how do you express that these earlier ages were a golden period? You say, well, they lived much longer than we do. Okay? Now, in fact, we know from anthropology that most human beings had very short lives. But they're saying at this primordial period, people lived because it was a better time.
And if we want to put a period of time, how far do we go in antiquity?
If we want to put a
Period of time, we want to put numbers.
I'm not
How
sure.
do we go in prehistory?
In what?
Prehistory.
Prehistory means it's a time before history. Is really not an historical period at all. It's part of a story time more than anything else. I mean, how long has humanity been here, Augie? You know better than I. Huh? Yeah, about 1 billion years. Yeah, I mean, the universe is about not quite 50, yeah, about 14.7 billion years, right? And humankind is kind of new on it, but has been here for millions of years. For these authors, the world is smaller, time is shorter, and they're thinking of a time before what we would call history. That's why I call it a primordial. And again, you have to. The message comes through the narrative, through the story. Louise.
This explanation is a result of the people's, they were trying to explain sin, how sin came into the world. These were people of faith,
Right.
as are we.
Right.
So how does a person who doesn't have any faith explain the problem of evil?
That I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are explanations for it. I mean, some of the explanations are simply the way we are constructed biologically, and also the understanding of evil would be different, because for us, evil is tied up with what we call sin, and you can only have sin if you are talking in relationship to God.
It seems hard to explain the existence of evil if you don't have faith, at least to me.
Well, I think that's one of the things faith does help us to do, is to explain why there is evil and wrong. All right, we'll pick this up next week. Okay. All right.